Let's take a breath together. So this morning's talk title, and we're working from a bank of talks that the entire organization has at their disposal. Cell phones are okay nowadays. See, we just kind of roll with it. And here's the thing about these talk banks, they're prepared in advance, and they are a really inclusive project. And sometimes the talk titles change and evolve, or let's say our understanding of them change and evolve. And the talk titles say their name. A year ago, I was in a different place with a different level of education. And Say Their Name is actually a project that belongs to black people. It doesn't belong to Centers for Spiritual Living. It's like the Transgender Day of Remembrance belongs to the trans community. It's like Pride Day belongs to the LGBTQIA+, give us a minute, we'll fill out the alphabet community. I can say that because I'm one of them. And so the theme behind this talk is about honoring our ancestors. And we're going to do that, but I need to speak to the unintentional cultural appropriation of the term Say Their Names, which is really a honoring of black bodies that have been killed by violence based in racism and prejudice and bigotry, which is very different than honoring our ancestors. And I want to make it okay that sometimes we have missteps, because we all do. In this process of evolution, we all misunderstand things. We all have our moments of evolution. One of mine was earlier this year when I looked at that title, I had a flinch, right? I'm not sure that title I'm not sure I should use that title. So instead of honoring that, and you'll see how all this fits in a minute, I looked at who wrote the talk, and it was the Reverend Dr. His name just fell out my head, and I can see his beautiful face right in front of me. Sign language, help me out, Deborah. Raymond, there we go. Thank you. See, all she had to do was look at me, and there it was. That's how we help each other out sometimes. Reverend Dr. Raymond Anderson, who is a black man. And so I justified that the talk title was okay because the black man wrote the talk. And that's ridiculous, because he might be okay with it, but if something inside of me is saying, flag, then that's mine to pay attention to. And next week, our talk is about letting go of our story. And so this week, I want to use this honoring of our ancestors to get honest about what story are we writing to start with. Because before we change our story, it might be a good idea to take some ownership of the one we've already written. Right? And so I could tell you about Emma Curtis Hopkins and her influence on New Thought. I can tell you that she was referred to as the teacher of teachers. I can tell you that Ernest Holmes was an avid student of Emma Curtis Hopkins, to honor Emma Curtis Hopkins. Or I could tell you that Emma Curtis Hopkins' life was tumultuous. That 3 years before burying her son, her husband divorced her. I can tell you that 30 years she spent as a wandering mystic, essentially homeless by choice, to take these teachings out into the world and prove to herself that God and only God was her supply. See, we can humanize our ancestors. We can humanize them. I could tell you about all of Emerson's writings, and you probably know about a lot of them. Or I could tell you that he was one of 8 children, 5 that survived to adulthood, and 3 that died before he was 30. I could tell you about his wife who died very shortly after they were married, and how his grief was so profound that years after her death, he actually visited her grave and dug up her coffin. And the beauty that he found even in the corpse. See, what if we start humanizing one another? What if we take away all of the pedestals? What if we take away all of the stories that we're writing about one another, even about ourselves, and begin to tell the story that's accurate, that's real? I could tell you about Henry David Thoreau and Walden and his amazing awakenings from his relationship with nature. Well, we could humanize Henry David Thoreau, and we could celebrate that while he studied at Harvard, he never had a Harvard degree. And he didn't have a Harvard degree because at the time, Harvard only offered degrees after you had finished your study for 3 years and proven enough wealth to be able to send them $5 to buy your sheepskin. Regardless of your level of study, it was completely worthless. It had no academic credibility whatsoever. And Henry David Thoreau said, let every sheep keep their cloth, keep their skin. Let every sheep keep their skin. And he refused to pay Harvard $5. He had it, but he's like, what kind of game is this? Right? He quit his job. While he met Emerson before he was actually deeply engaged with Emerson, he was Emerson's handyman. He taught the Emerson children, and he literally was the repairman and the gardener. But how many of us know that? Right? When we humanize one another, the narratives change. When we put our ancestors up on pedestals, it's easy to dismiss the gift of their teaching as unattainable by normal humans. Right? It's like, yeah, well, they figured that out and they lived it, but they're the exception. Right? We do the same thing with Jesus. He's not the great exception. He's a great example. The leaders in New Thought that I've mentioned this morning, they're not exceptions. They're examples. Emma Curtis Hopkins, while Phineas Parkhurst Quimby is oftentimes referred to as the father of New Thought, he's actually not. It's actually Emma Curtis Hopkins. But we lived in a time that was male dominant. And so even though Phineas Parkhurst Quimby left no writings of his own, his students took notes. And at the end, he turned all of his notes over to his primary students, the Dresser family. And it was Horatio Willis Dresser and the other members of the Dresser family that put everything down in writing and credited Quimby. Now, none of that's bad or wrong. But how does our understanding of New Thought begin to shift and change when we read it from more level human perspective? That none of these folks had a magic ball. That none of them had a special inroad to truth or wisdom. That Thomas Troward, or Troward, we're constantly having an argument of how to pronounce his name, like that matters, but it does to a lot of people. You'd be amazed. Okay. Had one student. He was a judge for the majority of his life, and it wasn't until he retired from being a judge that he began to study. And he didn't even study New Thought. What he was studying was the relationship between cause and effect, which we later understood is New Thought. Right? He had one student the entire time, but he wrote everything down. So what if your only student is you, but you write your awakenings down? What if you journal for no other purpose than to add your wisdom, the divine coming through you, to the mix? Because when you're seeking answers, do we not go to the bookshelf? Right? Some of us do. If we're being honest, how many self-help books do we have in our libraries at home in mint condition because they've never been opened? Right? I have a few. That in itself is information from the divine. We're reaching out for answers, and yet we don't open the book. Why is that? Something inside of us knows where the answer is, and it knows it's inside of us. But the activity of reaching out might just open the door for us to know what we knew all along. Maybe we don't need to read the self-help books. Maybe we need to be about the business of writing our own. Not to help anybody else, but wait, what are they called? Self-help books. What if you accessed the ancestral wisdom, which is nothing more than divine intelligence infused in every single expression of humanity? What if you accessed that and wrote your own self-help book? It requires this thing that Deborah was talking about this morning, authenticity. And authenticity, as her quote, if I'm remembering this correctly, included courage and honesty. I submit to you this morning that our lack of courage and our lack of honesty is creating every problem we experience. And it's not a lack of courage to deal with life, it's a lack of courage to be honest. Because we've written all of these narratives, not about being honest, but about the mistake of lying. See, we have so deeply vilified ourselves and one another that in order to be honest, we have to admit that we lied, and we can't even get there. Because to lie is so egregious that honesty becomes unavailable. Our ancestors that I mentioned this morning lived beyond that. They lived their truth. They didn't sit around. I can't imagine that when Emerson went to his wife's grave, that he did so worrying about what somebody else was going to think about it. That when he journaled about it, that he was worried about what you and I were going to think about the morbidity or not of that umpteen years later. I don't think he thought about that. When Emma Curtis Hopkins said, I'm going to spend the next 30 years traveling and teaching these teachings, because she saw it as a shift from a profession to a ministry. And if it's a ministry, then if I just minister, it will care for itself, it being source. Now, I've had that thought since ministerial school, of being on the road, living in a bus, just teaching these teachings to everybody who will listen. The difference between Emma Curtis Hopkins and me is that Emma Curtis Hopkins was all in, and I have a ton of reservations. I have a ton of earth conditioning that says, how's that going to get paid for? People will think I'm crazy. My wife will divorce me. Blah, 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 blah. All of it's made up. All of it. Every single bit of it is made up. What separates them is they heard God's call and they just said yes. No matter what it looked like, no matter what anybody else thought about it. Thoreau's time in the woods was not for the purpose of writing a book. It was so that Thoreau would understand Thoreau. And he wrote it down and it became a book. I invite you this week to throw good and bad, to throw right and wrong, to throw more or less, to throw all idea of judgment away and look honestly at you. What story are you writing? What narrative is playing out in your life? Is it honest? Or is it a narrative someone else has written that you are living because you lack the courage to be honest? You don't need to share it with another soul. But we each, as we say in the South, at some point everybody has a come to Jesus meeting. It's that place where we get real with ourselves. I think the most honoring thing we can do for the New Thought ancestors, the people that collectively gave us this gift, is to walk in the example that they set for us. Not to read everything they wrote. To go beyond that, to go to that place of how it got written. By listening deeply, and by trusting that whatever made us, and I don't mean the sperm and the egg, I mean the spiritual made us. Whatever this thing is that creates out of itself, by itself, to be itself, will in fact take care of itself if we will get our humanness out of the way. Perhaps. Let's take this into prayer. And so as I recognize the infinite, that ever-present allness, the one, I recognize that it is infinite intelligence, that it is absolute abundance, that it is infinite possibility, the changeless, formless, that always changes form, that knows itself, that is itself. And so I know that it is my life, that it is the very breath that is breathing me. And so knowing that it is my life, I know that all that it is fully available to me in every moment, every breath. And so I simply say yes. I say yes to letting go of every distraction, every conditioning, every belief, every assumption that separates me from the truth of me. Knowing that as I know the truth of me, I know the truth of every element of creation. One truth. Oneness. Wholeness. I say yes to that. And I celebrate its magnificence being made manifest in the form of alignment. The simple removal of everything that's not it. Opening the floodgates of infinite affluence, unrestricted flow. And so I let go. I say yes to being that. I let it be. And so it is.